Welcome to episode 1 of our data literacy series. Today we're looking at an IELTS writing task 1 multiple chart question on oil production in 2024. We'll focus on how to read and describe the data clearly. Let's take a look at the task. The bar chart and pie chart below provide information about the daily volume of oil production and the proportional share of the global total for the top 5 producing nations in 2024. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Before we start writing, take a moment to understand what you are looking at. You have 2 charts. On the left, a horizontal bar chart showing daily oil production for the United States, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Canada, and China, measured in millions of barrels. On the right, a pie chart showing how global production is distributed. So we are dealing with 2 different types of data: absolute volume and proportional share. Let's zoom in on the bar chart and take a closer look. The United States yields the highest level of production at 22.8 million barrels per day, a figure significantly higher than that of any other country shown. Saudi Arabia and Russia follow in second and third place, with production levels of 10.9 and 10.5 million barrels respectively. There is then a noticeable drop in volume. Canada produces around 6 million barrels per day, while China's output is slightly lower at 5.3 million. At this stage, a clear pattern emerges. The United States maintains a dominant lead, while the remaining 4 nations fall within a much narrower production range. Now let's look at the pie chart. The United States accounts for 22% of global oil production. Saudi Arabia and Russia contribute similar shares, at 11% and 10% respectively. Canada and China make up smaller proportions. However, the most noticeable feature is that 46% of global production comes from other countries. This shows that, although the top 5 producers are significant, a large share of supply is distributed across the rest of the world. At this point, take a moment to think about the main features. Try to identify 2 or 3 key points before moving on. This step is essential because your overview should focus on these main ideas. There are 2 main features here. First, the United States produces significantly more oil than any other country. Second, global production is not concentrated in just a few nations, as nearly half comes from other countries. These are the points you should highlight in your overview. With these key points as our foundation, let's start drafting the full report, beginning with a clear introduction to the charts. The bar chart and pie chart illustrate global oil production in 2024, comparing the daily output of 5 leading nations in millions of barrels and their respective shares of the total market. In this opening paragraph, I clearly introduce the topic, the time frame, and the units used in both charts. Notice that I used the present tense verb illustrate because when you are answering the task, the charts are right in front of you and are visible in the moment. This leads to a golden rule for IELTS. Always use the present tense when you describe what the charts are doing, even if the data itself is from the past. In this paragraph, I also defined both measurements, volume and percentage share, so the reader immediately understands the dual nature of the data. With the introduction complete, let's move to the overview, where we highlight the main trends without using specific numbers. Overall, it is clear that the United States was the world's dominant oil producer by a significant margin in 2024. Furthermore, while the top 5 nations accounted for over half of all global production, a substantial portion of the world's oil was still provided by other countries. In this section, I focus on the big picture before diving into specific data points. I highlight the main trend by showing that the United States was the dominant producer. Notice that I used the present tense is clear for my observation, but shifted to the past tense was for the data itself. If that feels confusing, just think of it this way. You are the observer when you describe the chart in front of you. That's the present tense. But you are a reporter when you talk about what happened in 2024, and that's always the past tense. I also chose the phrase significant margin to emphasize that massive 11 million barrel gap. You'll notice I avoided specific numbers here. The goal of an overview is to summarize the key features, not to list every figure from the chart. With our big picture overview established, let's move into the details. In this first body paragraph, we're going to back up our claims using the specific production volumes from the bar chart. In terms of volume, the United States yielded 22.8 million barrels per day, which was more than double the output of the second largest producer, Saudi Arabia, at 10.9 million. Russia followed closely in third place, producing 10.5 million barrels daily. There was then a noticeable drop in volume. Canada produced around 6 million barrels per day, while China's output was slightly lower at 5.3 million. In this paragraph, I shift my focus from the general trend to the specific production volumes. I established a clear hierarchy by comparing the leader directly to its closest competitors. I selected the past tense verb yielded because it is a formal, professional term for resource extraction. Instead of just listing numbers randomly, I organized the data to highlight the sharp drop-off that occurred after the top three nations. Now that we've covered the raw volume, let's shift our perspective to the proportional distribution. To do this, we'll turn our attention to the pie chart to see how these nations fit into the global market share. Looking at the proportional distribution, the United States represented just over a fifth of the global total. Although these five nations were the primary contributors, the remaining 46% of global oil production was supplied by the rest of the world. Finally, I moved from volume to proportional distribution, shifting the focus to the pie chart. I compared the contribution of the United States with the rest of the world to provide a broader perspective. I used the phrase just over a fifth instead of a precise percentage to demonstrate flexibility in describing data. I also used a complex sentence with although to introduce contrast, which helps improve the grammatical range score. And that is our complete report. We've managed to take two different sets of data and weave them into a single logical story. But before we go, I want to leave you with one very practical skill. Writing a great report isn't just about the big paragraphs. It's about the small, intentional upgrades you make at the sentence level. Let's look at a skill upgrade that can instantly change how an examiner sees your work. Let's look at a common way to describe the top two producers from our bar chart. I'll call this a level 1, basic sentence. The United States produced 22.8 million barrels of oil, and Saudi Arabia produced 10.9 million. There's nothing grammatically wrong here. It is clear and it is accurate. But it's just a list of facts. To really impress an examiner, we want to transform this into what I call a level 2 analytical sentence. Watch what happens when we add just a few layers of sophistication. In terms of volume, the United States yielded 22.8 million barrels per day, which was more than double the output of the second largest producer, Saudi Arabia. See the difference? We didn't just change the words, we changed the depth of the information. First, we improved the vocabulary by swapping produced for yielded and output. Second, we increased the grammatical complexity by using a relative clause, that which was part, to connect two separate facts into one fluid thought. But most importantly, we provided data interpretation. We didn't just list 22.8 and 10.9. We identified the relationship between them, more than double. That is the hallmark of a high-level candidate. That's it for this episode. We've analyzed the charts, produced a full report, and practiced upgrading a basic sentence to a high analytical level. Now head over to the IELTStime.com, where you can see the full version of the report we wrote today. While you're there, take this short quiz to see if you can spot the best analytical upgrades for yourself. I'll see you in episode 2 very soon. Until then, happy writing.